All right, we are on class number 16. Class number 16. In fact, this is going to be our last study per se of the series, and that this will be the last Sowing the Seed unique topic. Next Wednesday, Lord willing, I would like to do a review, not necessarily give you a test in the sense of a college classroom test, but to kind of go back over everything and see what we can recall and make sure that we're ready to put all of these things into practice. A lot of material, but there are some points of each one I want to make sure we go home with and are ready to take and use throughout this next year to teach others as we take them the gospel, and that we'll know where to begin and the questions and being better capable of answering them, hopefully, by doing this series together. Tonight, though, we're going to conclude with the Lord's Supper. I'm actually meant to do this study long ago, back when we were talking about the parts of worship, and for some reason I just left it out, and so I was trying to think, what have I missed, and I knew I would think of something, and this is what it was. So let's do that this evening, the Lord's Supper. Yes, sir. Oh, we need some more, yeah. Tell you what, let me just hand these back here, and you can pass them around as needed. No problem. All right, by way of introduction, let's begin in the Old Testament. Now, under the Old Law, did they have to keep the Lord's Supper? No, not under the Old Testament they did not, of course. However, there was something that they partook of in the Old Testament that kind of shadowed the Lord's Supper, that had or was commanded for a lot of the same reasons, to be a memorial and to do so often. What was that feast that they partook of that we're talking about? Yes, the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's exactly right. The Feast of Unleavened Bread. In fact, let's go to Exodus chapter 12. The first blank there, the Feast of Unleavened Bread was a shadow of the Lord's Supper. In fact, we'll notice that it's during this feast that God would literally transition from the Passover feast or the Feast of Unleavened Bread to the Lord's Supper in the New Testament. We'll see that in just a moment. But Exodus chapter 12. Look at verse number 17. Someone read that for us as we see the beginning of the institution here of this feast. Exodus 12, verse 17.
And you shall observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for in this selfsame day I have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall you observe this day in your generations by ordinance forever.
Very good. This was an ordinance. They were to partake of this unleavened bread, and they were to do it for what reason? Verse 17. Because in this self-same day, what had taken place? It's going to be a long night, isn't it? I'm sorry, some of you are saying it, I'm just not hearing you. Yes, the Exodus. Yes, He's going to deliver them, of course, from Egypt. Keep in mind, this is the final plague that has taken place, hence the term Passover. What is the Passover a reference to? Good, the death of the firstborn, the final plague. The Lord Himself passed over the land of Egypt. He passed over, and more specifically, what He means by that is the fact that He passed over the homes that had the blood there on the doorpost, on the of the male lamb. Remember all the details. He had to be a male and without blemish, and so that blood was there, and He passed over those homes that had that blood. If they did not have the blood, of course, He did not pass over. The first born child was taken from them. And so that's the idea of this Passover. And so it began when the Lord passed the blank there over Egypt. Exodus 12 and verse 17. Now look at verse 18. How often were they to partake of this feast? Was it every week? No, not at all. It was once a what? Once a year, that's right. Verse 18, I believe that's what I heard. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. All right, the first month beginning on day 14. Now, when you go to Leviticus 23, you'll actually notice there that it's day 15 through day 21. And basically what's going on is day 14 would be the day they would kill the lamb. That was the day that the Passover took place. Day 15 would be the first official day of the unleavened feast. Day 14 would be the Passover, in other words. And then you've got day 15 through 21 would be the 7 days of not eating leavened bread. And so you have day 15 through 21. Now, look at verse, and so what was the blank there? I want to make sure I don't get ahead of myself. The feast was to be taken once every what? Year. Very good, year. All right, now look at verse 27. Verse 27, let's read it together. You shall say, by the way, look at verse 26, make sure we know what's going on. It shall come to pass when your children shall say unto you, what mean ye by this service? All right, your kids come up to you, parents of Israel, and say, what in the world are we doing? What is this feast of unleavened bread? What is this Passover? Verse 27, here's what you're going to say, parents. It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses. The people bowed the head and worshiped. And so its purpose was to remind the blank there, Israel, of their deliverance from Egypt. It was to remind them of their deliverance from Egypt. It was a memorial, much like the Lord's Supper today, but a different kind of deliverance. All right, let's go to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22, and see this transition. By the way, when was the day of Pentecost in relation to the Passover feast? 50 days. Very good. 50 days after counting on the morrow from the Sabbath, is the way we would put it. 50 days you'll count, and that will be the day of Pentecost. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But Luke 22, we're going to see this transition. Look at verse number 7. Verse number 7. In the first century, the Jews, of course, still abiding by the precepts of the old law. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. Verse number 8, he said unto Peter and John, go and prepare us the Passover that we may eat. And they said unto him, where wilt thou that we prepare? He said unto them, behold, when ye are entered into the city, there shall a man meet you bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house wherein he entereth. And ye shall say unto the goodman of the house, the master saith unto thee, where is the guest chamber, where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? Ye shall show you a large upper room furnished, and there make ready. And they went and found as he had said unto them, and they made ready the Passover. All right, so they're participating in the Passover feast. Now look at verse 14. And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him, and he said unto them, with desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not eat any more thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took the cup and gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I say unto you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God shall come. And he took bread and gave thanks and brake it and gave it unto them, saying, this is my body which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. What's taking place here?
He's instituting the Lord's Supper for the future.
Absolutely. He's instituting the Lord's Supper just for that reason, as Carlos said, for the future, for the church. And so they sit down to partake of the Passover meal, and he's going to institute then to make that transition, if you will, into the new law. That is, of course, the Lord's Supper is now going to be that memorial. And so the Lord's Supper, letter B, began during the observance of what? Passover. Very good. Observance of the Passover. And this serves as a blank of Christ's death for our sins. What do you think goes there? A memorial. That's exactly right. A memorial. 1 Corinthians 11 says just that. This ye do, referencing the bread. This ye do, referencing the cup, in remembrance of me. In remembrance of me. Now, a major difference between the two. They did that once a year. The Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. How often do we in the New Testament, and this is where we begin to differ from many in the religious world, how often do we partake of the Lord's Supper? First day of the week. We partake of it weekly. Every first day of the week. The blank there, of course, being that of first. All right, so here's where we get into the scripture. Let's talk about it. When do we take it, and how often do we take it? All right, now, does the Bible come out and say, you must partake of the Lord's Supper every first day of the week? No, that passage is not there. Does the Bible come out and say that we must give every first day of the week? Yes, it does. 1 Corinthians 16. And so some would say, well, yeah, we got to give every first day of the week, But he doesn't say that about the Lord's Supper. So how do we know, and why do we teach, command, even that we must do it on the Lord's Day, every first day of the week? Let me ask you this. Would it be acceptable then to not partake of it every first day of the week? No. Well, how come? It doesn't say you have to do it, right? This is obviously the questions that we get. How do we answer that? Okay, the disciples partook of it. Absolutely. Exactly. That's right. That's right. Remember, there are at least three ways, well, not at least three, there are three ways in which we get our commands, if you will, from the New Testament. I mentioned before. Number one is direct command, and number two is, well, that one too, that would be number three. It doesn't matter the order, but necessary inference, and then also apostolic what? Example. Apostolic example, right? Be ye followers of me as I am of Christ. And if the apostles did it on a regular basis, that of course meant that they were commanded, and we are to do as they did. And so, when and how often? Every first day of the week. Now let me show you how we can be sure that we need to be doing this every Sunday, every Lord's Day. Let me also mention this before we jump into this. Where does the Bible say that we must worship every first day of the week? Where do you see that verse where Jesus says you've got to worship me on Sunday? Is that verse in there? No, it's not. No, it's not. So keep in mind, when what we're talking about here, we're really in the same boat. If you want to say that you don't have to take the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, then really you could just go ahead and say you don't have to worship every first day of the week. Many of them might even agree with that, because we're going along the same lines here. There's no direct command, so to speak, but yet it is necessarily commanded. Right? You're confusing me. Well, let's talk about it. Matthew 28 and verse 1. The significance of the Lord's Day. Think about how many things in the New Testament took place on Sunday, the first day of the week. First of all, our Lord was, of course, resurrected, the blank there, on Sunday. Matthew 28 and verse 1, and any of the other four Gospels for that matter, three Gospels. Jesus was resurrected on Sunday. All right? What else, before I just put these all up here, what else happened on Sunday in the New Testament that was very significant? Good. The church was established. Excellent. That's the second one. The church was established. Acts 2 and verse 1. How do we know the church was established on a Sunday? Okay, well, he rose from the dead on Sunday. That's true. Wasn't the same day that he rose, though. It was the same day of the week that he rose, but not the exact day that he rose. It doesn't say Sunday in Acts 2, but it does tell us something about that day. Acts 2 and verse 1. Somebody just said it. Pentecost. What day did Pentecost fall on? Okay, you count 50 days after the morrow from the Sabbath. In other words, the day after the Sabbath, count 50 days. What was the Sabbath day? What day of the week? Saturday. What would the day after the Sabbath be? Sunday. All right, what's 50 days after Sunday? Well, what's 49 days after Sunday? I had to do this same thought process because I thought in my mind, something's not right here. But if you think about it for a moment, day 1 is Sunday. Day 2 is Monday. Day 3 is Tuesday. Day 4 is. Day 5 is. Day 6 is Friday. Day 7 is Saturday. Day 8 is Sunday. 8 plus 7 is 15. 15 plus 7, a little math, is 22 plus 7 is 29 plus 7 is 36 plus 7 is 50. Right? You say, why did you do all that? Because we need to make sure we know that. It's the morrow after the Sabbath, right? It started on a Sunday, and 50 days later, the 50th day from Sunday is going to be Sunday. And I thought the same thing. I was thinking, well, that's not right. That's a Monday. It'd have to be the 49th day, but it does, in fact, fall on Sunday. So anyways, say all that to say, letter B, the sub letter I there, 1, Pentecost, of course, always occurred on that first day of the week, Sunday. Yes, sir.
I don't know what prompted the question, but on the way to services tonight, my granddaughter said, well, I have a question. What would happen if they changed Sunday, the name Sunday, to Tuesday? She thought we were wedded to to the name.
Yes, yes.
Rather than and I said, well, if they made Tuesday the first day of the week, we'd meet on Tuesday.
That's right. That's a good point. Right? How many times do you see the word Sunday in the New Testament? You don't see it. You just see the first day of the week. Doesn't matter what it's called. I've never heard that question before. That's the young mind. I love that. That's a good question, though, Glenn.
Well, in some cultures, the first day of the week is Friday.
That's right. That's exactly right.
What do we do?
Yeah, I mean, and you think about, well, for us, of course, we call it Sunday. And you could, I guess it goes back to calling it Friday or any other day, but best we know, calendar related, this is the first day of the week. Now, let me ask you this. On that note, could it be possible that we're not doing it on the first day of the week? That would have been the Jews' first day of the week? Are we going to be lost for that? No. No. We as a nation, I guess, I don't know how everybody, I've never really done a study on how everybody does their calendars across the world, but we as a Christian nation anyways, we call Sunday our first day of the week, and so we meet there.
And just about, if you look at it, just about all of those days of the week, all 7 of them, are kind of have this Roman influence, Roman sort of deities. I mean, they really weren't necessarily inspired by any sort of etymology that having to do with Christianity.
Yeah.
They were, the people who set the calendar, and not, I mean, God set the calendar in that He created the world in 6 days and rested on the
Yes.
Sabbath.
Yes.
So there's only 7 days. One of those days has to be the first day.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that basically the Romans and cultural cognomens that go with those words like Saturday, from Saturn and all this kind
Yes.
of. That's really where those things come from. They're not even particularly Jewish.
Yeah, we go back to the Romans. Yeah, that's interesting. That's good. See, and that's one of those things. I'm glad I've got some help on that because I didn't know that. That's very good, and that's important to know. I like that. Yes, sir.
It would also depend. The first day would depend on where you are.
That's true.
Sunday here.
That's true.
Is not Sunday on the other side of the.
That's exactly right. And so obviously, I mean, is only one of us right, or can we all have our first day? So do they have to worship over there in China at? What time do we start? 10 p.m. or whatever it would be, So
They're 12 hours away. That's my brother-in-law is right now.
there you go. They're exactly 12 hours away. Yeah. There you go. So that's interesting. That's very interesting.
Isn't it interesting though that because the Romans chose these names, but they also chose 7. If it was outside of what the Jews were doing, it's interesting that they did choose 7 though as well.
Yeah, I mean that had to always be accepted, I guess. I mean from the beginning. I don't know of any culture that ever did it. I guess.
No, it's just the difference in what you call it. Like the Jews had their Hebrew names for these for what they call days. But but the Roman Empire, they just sort of Pax Romana. What's good for Rome is good for the world.
Right.
So they named all this stuff.
Yeah.
And then there are all kinds of Roman phrases that we use in law and medicine all the time. It's the same as the days of the week.
Yeah.
Essentially,
yeah. Very good. Very good. Very interesting. All right, let's keep going. Any other thoughts? Anybody else? All right. I like that. Letter C there. We've already talked about 1 Corinthians 16. What took place every Sunday as well that was commanded? The giving, the contribution, the giving. The church gave every Sunday, and they were commanded to do that. The church at Corinth there, the assembly, they were to give every first day of the week. And so you begin to put all these pieces together, right? God gave us a brain, and we can use it and realize they were getting it. This was happening every first day of the week. In fact, if that's not enough, go to John chapter 20. I find it interesting. We see them assembling on the Lord's Day as Jesus began to show them even before the church was established. Based on passages like John 20 and verse 19. Now, maybe not everybody was doing this yet, but some certainly were. John 20, verse 19. Then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Jesus and stood in the midst and said unto them, Peace be unto you. He tells us that it's the first day of the week and mentions that about their fear of persecution there. They shut the doors. for fear of the Jews. And then if you look at verse number 26, and after 8 days, and there's that 8, right? After 8 days, again, his disciples were within, and Thomas was with them, and so on. What were they doing every 8 days, if you will? Every first day of the week, they were already assembling. They were getting together. Even before the church came, they were beginning that practice, as the Lord was, of course, showing them this new way. And so the disciples assembled there, the blank, every Sunday. They began to, anyways. It appears they began doing so before the church came. And obviously, once the church did come, Acts 2 and verse 42, I'll give you a moment to turn there. I know you're filling in the blanks. And then go to Acts 2 and verse 42. Just so I know that you're there and ready, I'll let somebody read that when you get there. Acts 2 and verse 42.
And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and in breaking of bread and in prayers.
Good. They continued meeting steadfastly or consistently, the blank there, after the church did come, after it was established. They continue to do so. We're going to talk about verse 42 and the four parts there in just a moment. So if you're wondering about that breaking of bread, we're going to get there. But for the purpose of Sunday, let's keep going. I'm just showing you all these things that took place on Sunday. And then Acts 20 and verse 7. Let's go there now. The blank there, consistently or steadfastly, would work just fine. We're to letter F, number 2, letter F. Somebody read Acts 20 and verse 7. You know this passage.
Now, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul read it to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight.
Very good. All right, what day of the week was it when they met and broke bread? The first day. First day of the week. The Apostle Paul made special, I'm going to explain that in a minute, special effort to assemble on the Lord's day. We'll see why in just a minute. Larry?
There's some in the church now that are using that to say that you can take the Lord's Supper on a day other than Sunday because it was until midnight.
Oh,
So
is that right?
would have been Monday.
Yep.
If they met on Sunday and he preached till midnight, and then they took the Lord's Supper, it would have been Monday morning.
Okay, so they're arguing. I see. Well, look at the... Well, it may be so, but what do you know about... How did their days work? How did their timeline work in the first century?
How did it run?
So what's that? 6 in the morning till 6 the next morning, right? Right. Midnight would be what time?
In other words, if the day is 6 until 6, then midnight would be within the same day. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what I'm getting at. Where'd that go? Acts 20 verse 7. In fact, you noticed earlier it referenced the Lord them meeting at even, in the evening on the first day of the week, right? That would basically be the equivalent of our morning. Now, it was in the evening, but as far as we're talking, but their day started in the evening, right? You go back to Genesis chapter 1. The what and the what were the first day. The blank and the blank were the first day. The blank and the blank for the evening and the morning, because that's how they counted. We go morning to evening. They went evening to morning. And so nonetheless, though, even that aside, you've still got the fact that we don't know exactly what time they took the Lord's Supper. And there's no way to prove that they did not take it on the first day of the week there. But I had never heard that before.
Look at verse 11.
Yeah, we're going to get to verse 11. When he therefore was come to again and had broken bread and eaten, talked a long while, even till break of day, so he departed. And so we'll go ahead, and I'll just go ahead and mention it. But in verse 11, based on verse 11, what was the order of events? All right, therefore was come up again, he had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till the break of day. What's the talking a long while? The preaching. So what happened before the preaching? The Lord's Supper, the breaking of bread. We're going to get back to verse 11, though, in a little bit. But is that what you were leading into there? Yeah, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And this breaking of bread, we're going to talk about this, whether it's, in fact, we're about to go there. Before we do, let me make one more reference here. Oh, it's already up there. Finally, John called, Revelation 1 and verse 10, again, that blank there was the word special. Letter G, John called Sunday in Revelation 1 and verse 10, the Lord's what? The Lord's day. Just like we call it the Lord's Day, they did as well in the first century. It became known as the Lord's Day. Why? For all of these reasons and more. It was the day of the Lord. It was the day that they worshiped. It was the day that they gave, the day that they sang praises in the assembly, the day that they would preach or have Paul preach or whoever it was that was preaching that lesson to lead those prayers, to partake of the Lord's Supper, to give of their means, all the above. All right, so let's get to the argument now. And this will lead us right back to where we were really. But breaking bread, the argument is not a reference to the Lord's Supper. Breaking bread. What do they believe breaking bread references there in Acts 20 and verse 7? Sorry? A meal, yeah. A meal. Now, is it true that when the Bible references breaking bread, it could be referencing a common meal? Absolutely. In fact, we'll notice some times that is the case. Is it true that there are times that the Lord's Supper is referenced to as a breaking of bread? Absolutely. So how do we know? It's the same Greek language, so it's not one of those where we can just go and look at the Greek per se. There is one little trick, but outside of that, it's pretty much the same Greek language. So how do we know? Context. Well, as with anything else, really. Context, like the word oinos for wine. Some say, well, Jesus made the water into wine. Well, you don't know if it's fermented or not just based on the word oinos. It can be either one. You've got to look at context. And there are many words like that. And so we're talking about breaking bread in the context. That's how we tell. Acts 2 and verse 42 is a prime example. Acts 2 and verse 42. I mentioned we'd go back and reference this, and that's what we're going to do right now. Acts 2, let's read 42 through 46. Acts 2, 42 to 46. And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, and in breaking of bread, and in prayers. Fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done by the apostles. Look at verse 46, for time's sake. And they, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart. All right? Breaking bread is used twice here. Same language for the most part. However, one of these is in reference to the Lord's Supper, I would submit, and one of them is in reference to a common meal. How do we know? Because of context. Look at verse 42 and tell us which one you think it is and why. Looking at the context.
42 is easily the Lord's Supper.
Absolutely. It easily is. Why?
Because it's leaped into other aspects of worship that are
Exactly.
we can tell there. The prayers, breaking of bread, fellowship, doctrine, all of those things have a close linguistic relationship, so you have to keep them together.
Very good. That's exactly right. There's a reference to worship here. In fact, many commentaries, I find it interesting, believe that fellowship here references singing, the fellowship of song. I think that's interesting. I don't know that we can be sure about that, but I do find that very interesting. The blank there, just to make sure I'm not getting ahead of you, the letter B on number 3, the phrase can reference both the Lord's Supper and eating. In verse 42, breaking bread means communion or the Lord's Supper. We're talking about the Lord's Supper in verse 42. Just as Carlos said, doctrine, fellowship, and prayers show this was worship. This was worship. We're not talking about eating a common meal. In fact, you can be sure that's not what they were doing, because when they came together to break bread, Paul rebuked them, some of them, for trying to make that into a common meal and not taking of it worthily. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Also, I mentioned the Greek. You don't always get this. I believe there are a few references that reference the Lord's Supper that don't have this, but when you see the article the in front of it, so far as I found, in the Greek, when you have the article the in front of breaking bread, the bread, it's always a reference to the Lord's Supper. And it just so happens that verse 42 is one of those two cases that I found. the bread in verse 42. And so there can be no doubt that the bread is also another reason why it's a reference to the Lord's Supper. 46, though, does not have the bread. Look at verse 46 and tell us which that is based on the context and why you would conclude it is either the Lord's Supper or just eating a common meal.
They ate their food.
That's it. It's just that simple, right? They ate their food, right? How often were they doing this? Verse 46. Daily. From house to house, daily. If this was the Lord's Supper, this would give the authority for us to what? Do it every day. I'm about to show you, and you know this, many of you already, I assume, but I'm about to show you how we can be sure they didn't do it every day. They made sure they only did it one day. And Paul, man, he really made sure of that. And we're about to make note of that. But nonetheless, you see them here eating that every day. They were going from house to house, breaking bread, eating their food. And so in verse 46, breaking bread means eating. They ate their meat or food every day. I don't know about y'all, but I definitely eat my food every day, multiple times a day. And certainly they ate their meals together daily. In fact, verse 45 references them selling their possessions and goods, imparting to all men that every man had need. And it's in that context that you see them all enjoying those meals together. Every day they were equal in that sense. They could all enjoy the same meal as they were being sure that they gave and shared those goods one with another. All right, any thoughts on that before we keep going? Again, their argument is breaking bread means food. It can, but we know whether or not it does based on context. And so, let's go back to Acts 20 and figure out which one it is. Acts 20, based on the context, is this a reference to the Lord's Supper or is this a reference to a common meal? Because frankly, it makes a huge difference, especially if it is the Lord's Supper. Acts chapter 20, beginning in verse 6 this time. Actually, verse 5. Let's start in verse 5. These going before tarried for us at Troas. Remember, Luke is writing here. And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread and came to them to Troas, notice, in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. All right? What day did they get there? Well, we can be pretty sure it was Monday because look at verse 7. They abode there 7 days. Why, Paul, did you wait 7 days in Troas? Why didn't you continue on? Look at verse 7. Upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow. Why did Paul wait 7 days before he left? He wanted to be sure to do what with the brethren? Take the Lord's Supper, to worship with them. He participated in that assembly on the worship. He was ready to depart on the morrow. That is, of course, the very next morning. Now, look at verse number, that bell just rang, didn't it? Let's get these blanks. Breaking bread, here's going to mean communion as well. Letter C. They came together on the first day of the week. The first day of the week. This was worship. This was worship, not a meal, which is evident by the fact that Paul was what? Preaching. Preaching. Right? He didn't wait 7 days for a common meal. He was waiting to participate in that worship, and he preached the gospel. Furthermore, Paul ate after he broke bread. Now here's where verse 11 comes in. Verse 11. We've already made note of the other, so let's just make one other note here. When he therefore was come up again and had broken bread and what? Eaten. Broken bread and eaten. Breaking bread took place before he ate his meal. Right? What then would breaking bread have to reference? Something else. Not the meal, right? Unless it's referencing 2 meals he had. He partook of the Lord's Supper. Paul ate after he broke bread. And again, you know that he did not do the two at the same time. You know they're not one and the same because Paul completely and utterly rebuked the church at Corinth, making sure that they did not mistake the Lord's Supper for a common meal. 1 Corinthians 11, we don't even have time to get over there, but here we have "the" in front of bread once again, by the way. The article "the" is there, and so that's very helpful. Notice eating is mentioned as occurring after and separate from the breaking of bread. Also, verse 16. Very important passage. I want you to remember, if you're a person that marks in your Bible, And by verse 7, put verse 16 or draw a line, or at verse 16 put verse 7, however you want to do it. But connect verse 16 with verse 7, and really 5 through 7. For Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus because he would not spend the time in Asia, for he hasted, if it were possible, to be at Jerusalem for what? The day of Pentecost. Remember, he showed up there at the days of unleavened bread, and he wanted to be in Jerusalem by the day of Pentecost. He was in a hurry, and yet he waited 7 days before he left because he wanted to be sure to worship with the brethren on the Lord's day, and then he left as soon as that was over. The very next morning, he left and departed. He was in a hurry to get to his location, and yet he stayed. He didn't do that for a comment. He didn't need to wait 7 days to eat a meal with the brethren, but he didn't need to wait 7 days to worship on the appropriate day, the Lord's day. And so also Paul was in a hurry to make it to Jerusalem for Pentecost. And then number 1, why would he wait in Troas until Sunday for a common meal? I've got 2 minutes, and I don't even have time to really get into the last part, but let me give you the blanks here. I wanted to talk about this 1 cup deal. There are congregations that you may have been to that believe that there's only 1 cup, that you pass 1 cup around and everybody drinks the fruit of the vine out of that same cup. And the reason, in short, Matthew 26 to 29, he blessed the cup and gave them. They partook of the cup. And so many believe that we need to make sure to only have 1 cup. Let me give you the blanks. Jesus gave the cup filled with the fruit of the vine, Matthew 26 to 29. That's their argument. It was the cup, 1. Notice, though, we don't have time to look at it, but when he passed around the platter, right? Notice the platter didn't get any emphasis there, but the bread did, right? In other words, the point here is that Jesus was not blessing the plastic or whatever, or the, I don't even know what they would have made it out of, but he's not blessing the platter or the cup itself. He's blessing the Lord's Supper. He's blessing the bread. He's blessing the contents of that cup. Also, secondly, they drank the cup. So if we want to say the cup was that which was around the contents, well, they drank that cup. What do you think he's referencing there when he says they drank the cup? What's in the cup? That's right. He's referencing what's in the cup. 1 Corinthians 11:26. Thirdly, the cup was, Luke 22:17 and 20, the cup was poured out and the cup was divided. Okay? They divided the cup out. Okay? If they literally divided the cup itself, I bet that fruit of the vine went everywhere. Right? They passed the cup around. They divided it out and he poured out the cup. Question, you have a glass of water, how do you pour out the glass? That doesn't even make sense. He poured out the contents of the cup. And then finally, Matthew 26 and verse 28, the cup represents the New Testament, he tells us. It represents the New Testament in his blood. Question, would they argue that we should only use 1 copy of the New Testament in our worship services? Because the cup represents the New Testament, right? I wish I had more time to get into all that, but there's your blanks there. Cup, bread, cup, poured, divided, contents, and copy. Did you get all that? Thank you, brother. I appreciate that. I'll put this up here for just a moment. Jesus gave the cup. Notice the bread. They drank the cup. The cup was poured and divided. The reference is the contents. And then finally, we can only use 1 copy, the blank. And this is already, I posted this online already. So if you didn't get all those blanks, get online if you have the ability to do so and get the blanks there. Thank you so much.